I stood in the dusty kitchen with the signed paper in my hand, the ink still fresh enough to smell. The house was quiet except for the low creak of the old beams settling. Talvin Hill had once been alive with the sound of hired hands shouting across the fields, the lowing of full-bellied cattle, and my mother's voice calling everyone in for supper. Now it was just me, 31 years old, alone with the echo of everything I was about to walk away from. The farm was dying. The barn leaned like a drunkard, the fences were mostly gaps held together by rust and hope, and the pastures had turned to dry yellow stubble. Only a handful of thin cows and 2 tired horses remained. The workers had left one by one when the wages stopped coming. I couldn't blame them. I had signed the sale papers that morning. Harlan Stone, the merchant from Millhaven, had offered enough coin to let me start over somewhere west. Somewhere I wouldn't have to look at the graves of my parents every single day. I told myself there was nothing left to keep me here. I slipped the folded paper inside my coat, stepped out into the pale morning light, and walked to the stable. The gelding I kept for riding lifted his head when I approached. I was just tightening the saddle when a loud, sharp crack split the stillness outside the gate. I swung onto the horse and rode out. A wagon had tilted dangerously on the dirt road just beyond my fence line. The right rear wheel had snapped clean off after striking a large stone half buried in the path. Standing beside the wreck was a tall orc woman. She wore a travel-stained cloak, her dark hair braided tightly against the dust of the road. She stood with one hand on her hip, staring at the broken wheel with more irritation than panic. "Cha," she muttered in a low, rough voice. "This is exactly the kind of problem I don't need today." I reined in my horse a respectful distance away. "Looks like it." She glanced up at me. Her eyes were sharp, golden brown, the kind that had seen hard miles. For a moment we simply looked at each other, human and orc on the borderlands where that usually meant trouble. But she didn't reach for a weapon, and I didn't spur my horse away. She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Name's Leora Bran. I was headed to Millhaven. A cousin promised me work at an inn. Turns out the cousin left weeks ago and the inn is closed. Everything I own is on this wagon." I looked at the piled belongings, chests, tools, a few sacks of grain, and felt an odd twist in my chest. I was about to abandon an entire farm, and here she was carrying the last of her life on a single broken cart. I dismounted. "If it stays out here, it'll tip completely when the next wagon passes. Better to pull it into my yard where the ground is flat." Leora studied me for a long second, then gave a short nod. "I'd be grateful." She spoke softly to the 2 draft horses still hitched to the wagon, calming them with a firm hand on their necks. I tied my gelding to the fence, rolled up my sleeves, and got behind the wagon bed. Together we pushed and pulled. Her strength matched mine easily. The muscles in her arms stood out as she braced the broken axle. Sweat ran down my back and my shoulder burned, but we managed to ease the wagon through the gate and onto level ground beside the old barn. I straightened, breathing hard. "I'll ride into town and fetch Boren Sparks. He's the wheelwright. Should be able to fix it before nightfall." Leora wiped her hands on her cloak. "Thank you." I mounted up again. The sale paper crinkled inside my coat as I rode toward Millhaven. I passed the Lord's office where I was supposed to file the deed. My hands tightened on the reins, but I kept riding. I told Boren what had happened, bought a small bag of coffee, and turned back toward the farm without once stopping to hand over the paper. When I returned, the sun was already high. Leora had found the old hand pump by the house and was filling the water troughs that had stood empty for months. The steady creak of the pump handle carried across the yard. She didn't look up until I was close. "You didn't have to do that," I said. She kept pumping. "I know, but the troughs were dry. Leaving them empty is just waste." Her words landed heavier than they should have. For the first time in years, someone had looked at this failing place and seen something that could still be useful. Boren arrived before mid-afternoon with his tools and spare wheel. He worked quickly, grumbling about orc-sized wagons, but saying nothing else. By late afternoon, the wheel was back on and the wagon stood straight again. Leora paid him with a few coins from a small pouch, then began resecuring her belongings. She turned to me at the gate. "I owe you for the trouble." "If there's anything—" "There isn't," I cut in. "Safe travels." She gave me a long, steady look, then climbed onto the wagon seat. I watched her drive away until the wagon disappeared around the bend in the road. The dust settled. The farm fell quiet again. Inside my coat, the folded paper with my signature still waited to be delivered. I touched it once, feeling the edge of the parchment against my fingers. For the first time in months, I did not ride back to Millhaven to hand it over. My name is Edric Talvin, and for the rest of that day I stood at the gate wondering why the thought of leaving suddenly felt heavier than staying. The sale paper stayed on the kitchen table for days. Every morning I told myself today was the day I would ride into Millhaven and file it. I even folded it neatly and slipped it into my coat pocket more than once. But then the fence on the east side needed checking, or the water trough was low again, or the sky looked like rain, and I decided it was better to wait. The truth was simpler. I kept thinking about Leora Bran, the way she had calmed those draft horses with nothing but a low word and a steady hand. The way she had pumped water into the empty troughs without being asked. The way she had looked at my failing fields and said they were still good land. No one had spoken about this place like that in years. On the fourth morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I saddled the gelding and rode to Millhaven. The town was busy with market day, carts rattling over the cobbles, merchants calling out prices. I stopped at the general store and asked the owner if he knew a woman named Leora Bran, an orc who had arrived recently looking for work. He nodded. She's staying at Mara Harrow's boarding house, helps with the books in the mornings, quiet sort, works hard. I stood outside the boarding house for a long time feeling foolish. What was I even doing here? I had a farm to sell and a life to start somewhere else. Still, my boots carried me up the steps and my knuckles knocked on the door. Leora was sitting on the wide front porch mending a cloak. She looked up when I approached, surprise flickering across her face, but not displeasure. She set the needle aside and gestured to the chair beside her. "Edric," she said, using my name for the first time. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." I sat. For a while we talked about ordinary things, the road she had taken, the weather, how the town felt after the long journey. Then, without meaning to, I mentioned the farm. Her eyes sharpened. "That place of yours," she said, "the stream on the north side, does it still run in high summer?" I blinked. "It does. Slows a little, but never dries. And the east pasture. How much sun does it get in winter?" "Most of the day. The hill blocks the worst wind." She asked about the barn roof, which beams had rotted, whether the soil in the lower field held water or drained too fast. These weren't polite questions. They were the questions of someone who knew land the way other people know family. I answered every one. When I finally asked why she wanted to know, she looked out toward the distant hills. "I grew up on a farm in the Keldron Mountains," she said quietly. "My mother died when I was young. My father and I ran it together, cattle, vegetables, keeping the ledger straight. He taught me how to read the ground, how to listen to what it needs. After he sold the land and we moved to the city, he passed not long after. I tried tailoring for a few years, 4 walls and a needle. It felt like being buried alive. I kept remembering the smell of damp earth in the morning before anyone else was awake." She fell silent. I didn't push. Something in her voice made the air feel heavier, fuller. A few days later, I rode back to the boarding house. This time I didn't hesitate on the porch. I told her the truth. "My farm has work that needs doing. Fences down, garden gone to weeds, barn that needs patching, young horses that need proper handling. I can pay a fair wage, not much, but it's honest." Leora looked at me straight, the way she had the first day. "I take money for the work, nothing else. If the offer changes later, I walk away. Understood?" "Understood," I said. "Work is work. Pay is pay." She accepted. Mornings she would still keep the bookkeeping job at the general store. Afternoons she would come to Talvin Hill. The first day she arrived just after noon. She wore sturdy work trousers, a faded linen shirt, and old leather gloves. Her hair was braided tight against her neck. She carried no extra words, only a quiet readiness. "Where do we start?" she asked. I pointed to the east fence line, the worst stretch. We worked side by side. She drove stakes with clean, powerful swings, tested the wire by leaning her full weight against it, knew exactly where the ground turned soft and needed a deeper hole. She noticed how the wind moved across the slope and where the cattle would push hardest. I had been patching that fence for months and never seen half the things she saw in a single afternoon. When the sun dipped low, we stopped. She wiped her forehead and looked out over the pasture. "This is good land," she said again. I started to answer the same way I had before. "It used to be." But the words caught. Instead, I looked where she was looking. The same tired fields, the same sagging fences. For the first time, I didn't see only what was broken. I saw what could still be fixed. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the sale paper in front of me. The lamp burned low. I stared at my own signature until the letters blurred. Then I folded the paper and put it back in the drawer. For the first time in years, the farm didn't feel like a place I was waiting to leave. It felt like a place that might still be worth staying for. Leora came to the farm every afternoon without fail. She would arrive just after the noon hour, still wearing the plain shirt and trousers she used for her bookkeeping work in town. No long greetings, no wasted words. She would simply look at me and ask, "Where do we start today?" And we would begin. For 4 straight days we worked on the east fence line. She drove the posts with clean, powerful swings of the maul, tested every strand of wire by leaning her full weight against it, and knew exactly where the ground turned soft and needed a deeper hole. When I set a post crooked, she corrected it without comment. When I pushed too hard and my shoulders began to tremble, she said quietly, "A tired man makes more mistakes than a rested one. Sit down for a minute." I listened. I was starting to listen to everything she said. At first, I only invited her to stay for supper because the sun had already dropped behind the hills and the ride back to Millhaven would be dark. Then it became habit. She cooked better than I ever had. Thick bean soup seasoned with dried herbs, flatbread baked crisp on the iron skillet, and meat stewed slow with the last of the winter vegetables. The old kitchen, which had smelled only of dust and regret for years, began to carry the warm scent of real food again. I found myself looking forward to that hour more than I cared to admit. One afternoon she suggested we bring the kitchen garden back to life. We spent 3 days clearing the weeds, turning the soil, and planting rows of beans, squash, carrots, onions, and the hardy herbs she said would survive the first frost. Our hands moved through the same dark earth. At one point her fingers brushed mine as we pressed a seed into the ground. We both froze. Neither of us spoke. The touch lingered a heartbeat longer than it needed to, then we kept working. But something had shifted between us, quiet and warm, like the first real sunlight after a long winter. That evening, while we sat at the table with bowls of her stew, Leora looked out the window toward the new planted rows and said, "If we tend it well, there will be enough dried vegetables by autumn to last the whole winter." Autumn. The word hit me like a stone. I had been letting her believe we had a future here while the signed sale paper still waited in the drawer. I stood up without a word, walked to the sideboard, and brought the folded document to the table. I laid it between us. "Before you came," I said, my voice rough, "I had already signed the papers to sell the farm." Leora stared at the paper for a long time. The lamplight caught the edge of my signature. She asked, very quietly, "Have you filed it yet?" "No." "Why not?" I sat down again, elbows on the table, and told her the truth I had been carrying since the day her wagon wheel broke. I thought this place was dead. I thought I was done. Every morning I woke up and saw nothing but failure. Then you showed up with a broken wheel and a wagon full of everything you owned, and you looked at these fields like they were still breathing. You saw water that could be pumped, fences that could be fixed, soil that could still grow. You made me look again. I'm not asking you to stay. I'm not putting that weight on you. But I can't pretend anymore that you haven't changed how I see everything. She was silent for so long, I began to worry I had ruined whatever fragile thing had been growing between us. Then she looked up, her golden brown eyes steady. "I'm glad you haven't filed it yet." After that night, everything between us ran deeper. We talked while we worked and while we ate. I told her about my parents, about the slow way the farm had slipped through my fingers after they were gone. She told me about her father, about the mountains where she grew up, about the ache of loving land and still wanting to leave because staying hurt too much. One evening she said, "Sometimes people leave not because they want to go, but because they don't know how to stay anymore." The words struck me harder than any blow. A few mornings later we were planting the last row of young apple saplings along the south edge of the garden. Her hands were dark with soil, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. I said her name, Leora. She straightened. Yes? I didn't plan it. I simply stepped forward, cupped her face with my dirty hands, and kissed her. It was clumsy, earth-stained, her braid brushing my wrist. For one heartbeat, I thought I had gone too far. Then she kissed me back, fierce and certain, her fingers gripping the front of my shirt. When we finally drew apart, she looked at me, breathing a little faster, and said, "I'm here because I want to be, not because I have nowhere else to go." I answered, "I know, and that matters more than you'll ever know." That same night, I took the sale paper from the drawer, carried it to the hearth, and dropped it into the fire. The flames caught the edges, curled the paper, and swallowed my signature whole. I watched until nothing remained but ash. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest felt lighter. Leora stood beside me without speaking. She simply reached out and rested her hand over mine. I understood then that I wasn't keeping the farm because she had asked me to. I was keeping it because she had helped me remember that I still had the right to choose to stay. 2 weeks after I burned the sale paper, a letter arrived from Harlan Stone's office. It was delivered by a rider who didn't even dismount, just handed me the sealed envelope and rode away. I opened it at the kitchen table while Leora stood beside me, reading over my shoulder. The words were polite on the surface, but sharp underneath. They reminded me that I had signed a binding agreement. They hinted at legal trouble if I failed to honor it. They demanded compensation for breach of good faith. Leora read the letter twice, then set it down with a soft snort. "Kimuadat rekhongtich te chudat no ragia trikuamin," she said quietly. I looked at her. "What do we do?" She met my eyes. "We make the farm worth more than whatever they offered. Then they can't touch it." That same afternoon, we hired help. Dellen and Court Vey were 2 brothers from the edge of Millhaven, strong, quiet, and willing to work for fair wages. When they arrived, Leora greeted them like equals. She shook their hands firmly, looked them in the eye, and laid out the work without hesitation. I watched her take charge and felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time in years, the farm no longer felt like it belonged only to me. We started in earnest. We tore down the worst sections of the east fence and rebuilt them straight and strong. We patched the barn roof so it no longer leaked. We cleared the clogged ditches so water flowed where it was supposed to instead of pooling and rotting the ground. We cleaned out the old root cellar and shored up its walls. Every day the place grew louder with the sound of hammers, saws, and men calling to one another. The silence I had lived with for so long finally broke. Leora became the heart of it all. Mornings, she still kept the books at the general store in town. Afternoons, she rode back and threw herself into whatever needed doing. Evenings, she sat with me at the table, going over ledgers, planning the next season's planting, calculating how many more cattle we could afford to buy before winter. She noticed things I had stopped seeing. The south ditch was sending water the wrong way. The root cellar stayed damp because of a broken drain. The east pasture could grow winter grass if we seeded it now. She pointed them out not as criticism but as possibilities. One rainy afternoon, we were sorting through the old storage shed behind the barn. Dust floated in the shafts of gray light. We dragged out a heavy trunk that had belonged to my mother. Inside were things I hadn't touched in years, a few worn books, a folded, embroidered cloth, and a small portrait of my parents standing in front of this very house when it was still new and proud. I held the portrait for a long time, staring at their young faces. "They chose each other," I said quietly, "and they chose this place." I forgot that part, the choosing. Leora knelt beside me, her shoulder brushing mine. I turned to her, the portrait still in my hands. "I love you, Leora," I said. The words came out simple and certain. Not to keep you here with pretty promises, just because it's true and you deserve to hear it. She looked at me for a long moment, her golden brown eyes steady. Then she answered, voice low and warm. "I love you too, Edric. I've been waiting to see if you understood what those words really mean." A few days later, Cyrus Feld, Harlan Stone's man, rode up to the farm with 2 armed riders behind him. He was tall, sharp-faced, and clearly unhappy to be dealing with me again. He demanded compensation for the broken agreement and threatened to take the matter before the Lord's Council. Leora stepped forward before I could speak. "Show me the papers." Cyrus handed them over with a sneer. She read them carefully, page by page. Then she looked up. "This contract was never filed with the council. There is no official seal. There are no witnesses to the land transfer. Edric still holds full title. He can withdraw at any time." Cyrus's face darkened. He argued, but the law was clear. He left angry, promising that rumors would spread that I had been bewitched by an orc woman who wanted to steal the farm for herself. The whispers reached Millhaven quickly. Some people said I had lost my mind. Others said Leora had used some kind of orc trick to cloud my judgment. When I rode into town for supplies, a few old acquaintances turned away. I met their silence with my own. One afternoon at the general store, a man muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Edric's letting that orc run the place now. She'll take everything." I turned and answered clearly so everyone could hear, "Without Leora, this farm would already be sold and ruined. If you don't like her opinion, don't buy my cattle." I didn't fight with my fists. I didn't need to. Leora never asked me to defend her, but I saw the quiet gratitude in her eyes when I stood beside her anyway. By late summer, the changes were impossible to ignore. The kitchen garden was thick with green. The cattle had filled out and looked healthy again. The barn no longer leaked. The ditches ran clear, and new workers had begun showing up because word had spread that wages were paid on time. The farm was no longer dying. It was waking up. One evening, Leora and I stood at the new east fence. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the pastures gold. She rested her hand on the top rail and said softly, "It was never dead." I looked at the land that had almost slipped through my fingers and answered, "No, I just stopped seeing it as something alive." I took her hand right there, in the warm evening light. Then I asked her to marry me, not with an expensive ring, but with the plain truth I had finally learned to speak. "I want this place to be our home," I said, "if you'll choose it with me." Leora smiled, the same steady, certain smile I had first seen the day her wagon broke. "I'll say yes," she answered. "But I want to pick the new curtains for the kitchen. The ones we have now are terrible." I laughed then, a real laugh that carried across the fields for the first time in years. She squeezed my hand and said again, softer this time, "Yes." And just like that, the farm I had almost sold became the place we would build our life together. We held the wedding right there on the front lawn of Talvin Hill at the beginning of autumn. The grass had been cut short, the new fences stood straight and white, and the apple saplings we had planted together were just beginning to show their first hints of red. It was a small gathering. Dellen and Court Vey came with their wives. Mara Harrow brought a basket of fresh bread from the boarding house. The owner of the general store arrived with his daughter. A handful of neighbors who had slowly stopped turning away when they saw Leora in town also joined us. No grand ceremony, no expensive guests. Just the people who had watched the farm come back to life. Leora wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, the color of storm clouds at dusk with threads of green running through it like new growth. Her dark hair was braided with dried wildflowers she had gathered from the east pasture. When she walked across the grass toward me, the late sun caught on the braids and made them glow. I stood waiting in my best coat, the one I had almost worn to file the sale papers months earlier. As she reached me, I thought, if that wagon wheel had not broken that morning, my life would have taken a darker road than I could have imagined. We spoke our vows under the open sky, simple words, honest ones. When the small crowd clapped and cheered, Leora looked at me with the same steady golden brown eyes that had first seen life in this failing place. I kissed her there, in front of everyone, and for the first time in years I felt like I had truly come home. After the wedding, the house changed. Leora chose deep green curtains for the kitchen windows, the root cellar filled with jars of preserved vegetables and fruit. The garden produced more than we could eat, so we began selling the surplus in town. The barn no longer leaked. The pastures stayed green even as autumn deepened. Leora did not become a wife who stood behind me. She stood beside me. She kept the ledgers, planned the next season's planting, chose which bulls to buy, and told me plainly when I was being stubborn. I listened. I had learned how. 1 year later, we bought the neighboring plot to the east. I signed the new deed at the same lord's office where I had once almost handed over everything I owned. Leora stood next to me, her hand resting lightly on mine as the quill scratched across the paper. There was no pressure, no demand, only the quiet certainty of two people choosing the same future together. A few years after that, our first child was born. Then another. The house that had once been cold and empty now rang with the sound of small feet, wooden spoons clattering in bowls, and laughter that bounced off the newly repaired walls. Leora taught them how to ride, how to read the ledgers, how to press seeds into the earth with care. I taught them how to mend fences, how to gentle a nervous horse, and how to keep a promise even when it was hard. They grew up on land I had once been ready to abandon. We planted an apple orchard on the southern slope. Leora chose the spot herself. The first year we harvested only a handful of small tart fruit. She turned them into jars of sweet apple butter that filled the kitchen with a smell I had not known since my mother was alive. One evening, I stood in the doorway watching her stir a pot on the stove, the warm scent drifting around us. I stayed there a long time without speaking. She glanced over her shoulder and said softly, "I thought it was time this kitchen remembered the smell of apples again." I crossed the room, wrapped my arms around her from behind, and held her while the spoon moved slowly through the bubbling fruit. She understood what I could not put into words. Many years passed. Talvin Hill became one of the most respected farms in the Grayford borderlands. It was never the largest, but it was known for fair wages, healthy cattle, well-tended fields, and the simple fact that humans and orcs worked side by side without fear. Those who had once whispered about Leora eventually stopped. The work itself spoke louder than any rumor. One quiet autumn evening we sat together on the front porch. Our children played near the apple trees, their voices carrying on the breeze. The pastures stretched green and gold under the setting sun. I looked at the house, the barn, the fences, the land that had once felt like a burden too heavy to carry, and I said, "If your wagon wheel had not broken that morning." Leora leaned her head against my shoulder. "The wheel only broke," she replied. "You were the one who rode out to help." I understood then what she had been trying to teach me all along. Fate might open a door, but a person still had to choose to walk through it. I had planned to sell the farm and leave. I had signed the papers, packed my regrets, and convinced myself there was nothing left worth staying for. Then a woman named Leora Braun appeared on the road in front of my gate with a broken wheel and everything she owned piled on a single wagon. She did not save the farm with magic or grand gestures. She saved it by pumping water into empty troughs, by looking at dead land and seeing something worth tending, by swinging a hammer beside me, by planting seeds in the garden, by keeping honest ledgers, and by loving me in the quiet, stubborn way that made me remember I still had the right to choose to stay. I burned those sale papers in the hearth. Not because love made me forget reality, but because love helped me see reality clearly for the first time. This farm was not dead. I was not dead. And sometimes the best life is not the one you carefully plan, but the one that arrives the moment a broken wheel stops right in front of your gate.